Through a divine interruption of Yahweh, Isaiah had a vision, yet he managed not to forget his humanity. In chapter 6, he cries out, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." The work and word of the Lord revived Isaiah's humanity, and he was commissioned to a very bleak message to remind Israel of their covenant and of God's glory. Chapter 6 plays a significant role in the structure of the book, and it offers a rich layer of biblical theology that plays out in a much larger message of Isaiah. Chapter 6 describes how the prophet begins his ministry for God, as judgment upon Judah was necessary and inevitable. God called Isaiah to have a critical role in showing the people that judgment was a result of perversion of God's will. The chapter provides a date for this call to remind readers that Isaiah's ministry took place at a turning point in Judah's history. The 40-year reign of Uzziah was over, and it had been a time of economic growth and prosperity. The setting for the story of Isaiah's call is in the temple, as there the prophet sees God accompanied by a seraphim. Standing in the presence and holiness of God requires the purging of all immorality, and Isaiah recognizes this and believes that he will not survive his encounter with God, as he stands in solidarity with his people. He does not see himself as a morally upright person who has a right to stand in judgment over others. Yet in God's grace and mercy, he uses the seraph to purge the prophet with a burning coal so that he can begin his mission of announcing God's intention to bring judgment on Judah in hopes of reconciliation. The story of Isaiah's commission is one of a number of similar stories in the Bible, as it can be designed to add authority to what follows, and that's to get people to take it seriously. Yahweh's being the Holy One means that he is transcendent, sovereign, and awe-inspiring. It's interesting that Isaiah is the only prophet who volunteers to serve God. And a distinctive feature of his commission is the emphasis on Yahweh's kingship. Isaiah is told to tell people that he is commissioned to make it hard for them to listen. Jesus applies Isaiah's statements about his strange commission to use in his parables as well in the New Testament. The paradox of a prophet called to make people incapable of hearing God may have been a shock tactic to get people to listen as well. The precise dating of chapter 6 contrasts with the undated oracles in chapters 1 through 5, as specific events have prompted these oracles, but Isaiah did not find it necessary to state them. His call to be a prophet from God came in the year King Uzziah died, and he prophesied from 740 to 681 BC. Much of scholarship for the past 2 centuries have assigned multiple writers to Isaiah, dividing the book into 3 different sections, which consist of chapters 1 through 39, 40 through 55, and 56 through 66. However, these divisions come out on a scholarly debate. Readers must be aware that this position not only limits the power of God to communicate with his people, but also ignores the wide variety of specific, predictive claims about Jesus Christ foreshadowed through the book of Isaiah. Jesus even references Isaiah through the New Testament, affirming his authorship as he quotes from both sections of the book. An important consideration in the exegesis of Isaiah 6 is to avoid the tendency to break the narrative up into 2 sections, with Isaiah 1 to 8 that lead to the commission of Isaiah, and 9 to 13, which announces the coming spiritual desolation of God's people. Isaiah 6 requires both parts to be connected as one unit, because neither exists without the other. Isaiah's obedience to God in the purging of his sin, recorded in chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, is in direct contrast to God's people's disobedience to him and their blindness and deafness to spiritual truth. Isaiah 6, as it is interpreted as one unit, is critical to fully develop the things God reveals through the prophet. The tradition is aware that Isaiah's ministry did not prevent the destruction of the temple, or the scattering of its priesthood, the end of the dynasty, or the end of the national state. Isaiah was not called to keep Israel from its destiny, but to make Israel aware of their destiny. His mission was to delay Israel's comprehension of the divine plan until generations later, after Israel's endurance of two devastations of land and through two exiles. These events made it impossible for Israel to evade responsibility for its fate. Whether or not it's understood as an inaugural call, Isaiah 6 plays a significant role in the structure of the book. It introduces the central section of the larger literary unit of Isaiah, with both the need for a prophetic word and the fact that it will not be heard. Such revelation is also grounded in the historical realities of the day, so that prophetic proclamation would relate to the real world in which God's people live and die. The theological importance of God's filling the temple highlights the very presence of God on earth, where in fact the finite can contain the infinite, though it can never control the infinite. The interconnection of the heavenly throne room and God's presence on earth is made manifest in worship. The personal experience of the prophet in the presence of God is now turned to the commission and mission of the prophetic messenger to go and tell. The one who has been invited into the throne room of the king is now ready for sending, and he responds with a willing spirit. The mission sermon ends, yet the mission has only begun, and it will be a challenging one at that, as it is to God's own people, but includes all of the nations. It begins with what Isaiah has been given to see and hear, to know and proclaim, but it also includes a much bigger perspective beyond his own experience in life. The book of Isaiah records the visions of the prophet to witness to God's communication with his disobedient people. Isaiah reveals Israel's refusal to heed God's will because of their rebellion, pride, and self-will to establish government on their terms. The prophetic genre is both poetic and narrative in its approach and meets the basic requirements of prophetic literature that speaks with the Word of God about election and covenant, rebellion and judgment, compassion and redemption, and consummation. The first 6 chapters show God's judgment brought to bear upon Israel and Jerusalem, but then continues to record Israel's struggle to achieve political control as they were fighting against God's help, that led to the arrival of Cyrus from Persia to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. Isaiah 6 is a climax to the quandaries of Judah accounted in Isaiah chapters 1 through 5 and links the Lord of hosts to become the Holy One of Israel. The placement of chapter 6 shows its dependence upon chapters 1 through 5 that record allegations against the people's unwillingness to obey God. The narrative is easily dated to the 8th century because of the numerous historical references throughout the book of Isaiah. The experience in the temple helped Isaiah and the Israelites to discover the holiness of God, revealed by the heavenly creatures which cried out, and how they too should exemplify a reverent behavior before Him. God's holiness was also reflected in the angels who guarded Him. Isaiah's call revealed the omnipotence of God, and He is so powerful that He managed to shake the foundation of the temple. The encounter revealed to Isaiah the hardness of the task ahead of him, as he was to preach to the people who would not listen. His sinfulness in comparison to God's holiness was exposed. The cleansing component was important because it equipped Isaiah with the necessary purity that he needed as a prophet. The touching of Isaiah's lips with burning coal was symbolic of how God was ready to forgive the people and bring redemption. The call equipped Isaiah to convey a message that sacrifice alone was not enough to bring people in right relationship with God. People need to be faithful to be justified by God and not through sacrifice.